What do you see as the defining issues of the European election?
If I could name one or should name one item, it would be Ukraine, because it's of vital importance for the European Union and its existence into the future, its norms and values that we take for granted and that are now under fire, literally under fire in Ukraine. And linked to that is, of course, the necessity of for Europe to build up its own defense industry. These things come close together. They will require a lot of money. And so I think there are a lot of other issues too, like migration, the Green Deal, the competitiveness of the EU. But I think Ukraine will be the defining issue in the coming term of the European Parliament.
And how do you think that that changes over the next couple of years, and what kind? Do you think that there will be more commitment required from the Europeans, not just from a financial standpoint, but maybe from a military standpoint?
Well, it is to be feared that we go into that direction, that things might become very complicated for the Ukrainians, even with all the help that is now coming forward from the EU, from the United States. But like the French President Macron said, we might arrive at the point where they need more than just the financial assistance and the money to buy weaponry. That would be a very defining moment.
So you think that there's a possibility that European troops could be committed within Ukraine, that is a possibility that's on the table and that should be considered?
Well, I think realism imposes on us that we should consider it. Whether we should try to avoid it is, of course, also true. We should try to avoid it, but it would be irresponsible not to face up to it and take into account that at one point in time that might become a necessity.
And beyond the question of Ukraine, what do you anticipate the sort of policy consequences are going to be of this election in Europe? We see a much further swing to the right, particularly with the ID. What do you think because it's hard for sometimes to think as theoretically, what are the actual policy implications of that?
Well, I think one of the major implications of the drift to the right, I hope the center right and not the extreme right, but we'll see what the election brings, will be, I think, more emphasis on economic policies. We've had in the past term a lot of emphasis on the climate policies and everything related to that. We've taken a huge step forward. I don't think it was always sensible to do it in the way that has been done, especially by Commissioner Timmermans. And so we have to adjust this policy to better take into account the social and economic consequences of these policies. And I think that will be a very important part of the shift that will take place in this new, more to the right oriented parliament.
And in this new orientation, do you see the EPP and the ECR as a likely sort of allies in that?
Well, I think we already saw that in this term, and especially in the second part of this term, where if you look at when we had to vote, you saw the two groups coming closer to each other. Not entirely, there are still a lot of differences, but the divergences were less outspoken than they were in the beginning of the term. So yes, that is certainly something that is quite possible, and that might change the overall picture of the way in which the European Parliament is going.
And we were talking just before in the break, talking about sort of the Hemingway adage of going broke slowly at first and then suddenly. This seems to be a lot of the sort of concerns in Europe about competitiveness and its future economic viability. Macron says that Europe is basically mortal. Do you think that that is a correct sort of characterization of what Europe
I think mortal is, Mr. Macron has often used that kind of terminology. He declared NATO brain dead some time ago. I think today NATO is very much alive. So I hope we can say the same about the EU in 2 or 3 years' time.
But you wouldn't say it's brain dead.
No. But there certainly is a lot of work to be done. And the big challenge, if you talk about competitiveness, is of course what's happening in the United States with the inflation.
Well, so what do you think the correct response is? Because you have the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. You have China very famously and historically supporting its industrial sector. What is Europe's response to that?
I think two things. First of all, we need to involve the private sector more than we did until now, from the point of view of the EU. The IRA in the United States is basically about tax breaks that stimulates the private sector to invest in the things you want them to invest in. We should do that too, but we don't have fiscal authority at the European level, so we need to to stimulate the member states to do that kind of stuff at a national level. Secondly, talking about China, we should do what we have to do. If we want free trade, everybody has to play along the rules.
The Chinese, so that means tariffs and
the Chinese are not playing along the as the rules predict or oblige you to play the game. So we should take the consequences of that, and indeed should not shy away at tariffs or other measures.
So do you think tariffs should be looked at for things beyond, say, electric vehicles? Do you think that there is a much larger conversation to have?
I think we should. China has profited enormously from the free market system. We've invited them in. Western capital has gone there. Western technology has gone there, and so they should reopen their doors too, and they should play the game. And so wherever there is not a level playing field, we should intervene.
And so one topic where there may be a lot of consensus in Europe, from the right to the center to the left, is defense spending. And you, having sat on the budget committee, you know how difficult some of these conversations could be. Do you think that there could be appetite for joint debt on this topic, that this could unify Europe to get that defense where it needs to be?
Well, we've had a Corona facility where we had more than 700 billion European debt that has been created. We should first take stock about how that went. What were the weak points? And there are a lot of weak points in the way in which the Corona facility has been set up and executed, so we should take that into account. We should not forget that there is still a substantial amount of money left within that Corona facility. So I don't join those who say, now we do another fund and we do another facility and we do this and we do that. Let's evaluate, let's see how much money is left. Let's also see how much of the responsibility of, for example, defense spending has to be taken at member state level. And then see what eventually can be added value of a European initiative.